off with talking about defining and understanding work-life balance. So I'd like to pose this first question over to Chris. From your experience of working with executives, what does work-life balance mean for executives, and why is it so important?
I think the first thing to say here is that perhaps in the past it was something that was important but not necessarily strategic to the culture of the organization. And obviously what's happened in the last few years, all of a sudden this has been thrown out into the forefront of every discussion around culture. So I think whereas in my opinion it's a very personal thing, it's a lot of it's about prioritizing what's important for an executive in their life, and a lot of it comes down to what makes you happy at the end of the day, and are you achieving what you're wanting to achieve. But I think with everything that's happened in the last few years, we've lived a strange period, and I think all of a sudden now the quality of life and being happy in what we do every day is now extremely important, and I think it's very important for every executive. And I think to add to that, obviously as we businesses want to attract fantastic people and talent and leaders, the culture of the organization is absolutely fundamental, and that will be directly influenced by the CEO and the leadership team and how they actually deal with this topic.
That's very interesting, yeah, to know that it really comes, from the executives who may be looking for the opportunities that are also going to drive the culture within the organization when it comes to maybe work-life balance too. Great. Jennifer, is there anything you'd like to add based on what you might be seeing from executives in terms of work-life balance and what it means to them?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Chris shared, definitely this is sort of more part of the conversation than it ever has been before. With executives, it's top of mind. I think, maybe what we all know, but is worth stating that it's also sort of this constantly evolving topic, both sort of socially, but also just from an individual perspective, right? So what work-life balance means to me might mean something very different to my colleague, right? And so I think organizations and leaders are being more attentive and more attuned to understanding, what that looks like for each individual in their team, but also asking themselves, what does it mean for me, and how do I model that for my organization?
Great. So one of the other things might be is, what are some common barriers or obstacles that executives might see in achieving work-life balance? And I'm going to turn it over to Greta to ask you, what are some common barriers that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think, as Jennifer and Chris just mentioned, it's obviously a very personal thing. What is balance? Balance means different things, obviously, to different people. I think when you have a family, it may mean spending time with the family, of course. When perhaps you have some hobbies and interests outside of work, then of course, perhaps it means having enough time to do these things. For other people, it just means being able to switch off, after work. But what is after work? I think nowadays, especially also with COVID, it's become sort of, expected in a sense that you're always available, or that you're always reachable. And I suppose the barriers or the obstacles are really, in my opinion, three things. One is yourself personally. You could be a barrier to your own balance. Secondly is the company culture where you work in. What are their views, or what is the acceptance of flexible hours, of home office opportunities? How do they support you as well in terms of having a family and perhaps having your own home office setup, etc. And lastly is, I would say, if you're maybe in a specific department, for example, or obviously also depending on the role that you hold, this may also mean different things. And I suppose from my own personal experience, in fact, when I was asked to join this plan, I was actually wondering if I would be one of the, the best person to offer advice. Is really sometimes being able to say no. Really taking the opportunity to put your own priorities first, over and above what is expected out of you. But of course, easier said than done, isn't it? And really, it's then trying to find the balance.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Gabrielle, are there any obstacles or barriers that you've seen as well?
Yeah, of course. And I have also three of them. But before I tell you about those three, I would like to just frame what is flexible working. It's always important to understand that it's a style of work. That is flexible working. And you have many things. You have part-time, you have remote work, flexible time, compressed work week. You have hybrid remote work. So there are different types of flexible working. So it's a style of working, actually. So with that being said, I also 3 points. That's Greta, exactly the same, Greta. It's curious. But first of all, company culture, definitely I mean, it's a very different family owned company than a corporate, than going into an old school management style. I mean, you need to understand the culture. So yes, that is one of the barriers, definitely, company culture. The role itself, like Greta says, it's very different working in manufacturing, where you have to be on the site, very hands-on with the people, leading people and setting an example. And so it's very difficult to do a remote work, or versus sales. Sales, we can be everywhere in the world, and that's what we do, and you don't have to be at the office. And so it depends on the function, definitely, the role itself. And third, I think very important, but you would be surprised how a lot of people, there's a fear in everyone about losing out, not being at the office. And that is an obstacle for them to really have a work-life balance, because, there's, maybe I'm exaggerating, but obsessed with being in the office, or, they want to be there and interact and expose themselves to their bosses and everything. So for them, mentally, it's fear of being out of the office and maybe losing out. So those, I would say, are the three most important ones.
Yeah, definitely. I think the old saying of be in the office before the boss arrives and be there after the boss leaves, could definitely be an obstacle there in terms of work-life balance. And obviously, the type of role, like you mentioned, makes a difference too. Are you remote? Is it a permanent role? Is it an interim role? Things of that nature also depends as well. So just kind of, building upon that, looking at trends related to work-life balance, especially in the executive space, Greta, are there any shift in trends that you're seeing when it comes to work-life balance for executives?
I would say definitely yes. I think since COVID, certainly people have become more, I would say, aware of the fact that you can have work-life balance. You can work from home, but you can also work from the office. It's basically there are perhaps how to put it, there's a little bit more flexibility in the way we can obviously do our work. Having said that, I also agree with what Gabriel said earlier. It really depends anyway on the role that you hold, because unfortunately for some people, really being physically in the office is a necessity. And I think for these people, there hasn't really been a lot of a shift. They're still obviously expected to be physically there, and their role cannot cannot function otherwise. On the other hand, I think for certainly the younger people coming in, I would say that the executives generally who are a little bit more open and accepting of this work-life balance opportunities. Also, people not wanting to travel so much. We've had such an influx of things. Yeah, well, I don't need to spend so much time, traveling to work. I can easily do it at home, or I can have a virtual coffee, via Zoom or Teams. I don't need to be physically at the coffee machine to interact with people. And we have noticed. Here in Switzerland, it's actually quite common for people to work, for example, 80% or 90% and not 100%. This has always been the case, but actually since I would say in the last three years, we've seen really now an increase of people not wanting to work 100% anymore, to really have more flexibility. And also there's been recently companies having more sort of benefits, such as, for example, paternity leave that was in the past, never a thing really, and now it's been introduced, and obviously people want to take this or are expecting to take this. So yes, certainly there have been shifts in a lot of different areas and a lot of different sectors. Whether it's across the board, no, of course not, because again, it depends on the role, but certainly, definitely quite a big shift.
Yeah. Chris, are you seeing similar shifts relating to work-life balance, like Greta mentioned, in terms of, commuting and also working remotely, things of that nature as well?
Absolutely. So we work a lot with the technology environment, so the tech sector, and I think obviously that sector was quite advanced when it comes to home working, work from home and the flexibility and this kind of thing, and the environment. But obviously then COVID, has really exaggerated that whole thing, has accelerated this whole notion of flexibility. So I think what we see now then, and following on from what Greta has said, is that people have understood that performance comes from people being happy. It comes from people being well, physically and mentally, and so people are engaged, and they're overachieving. Okay, so those the facts prove this. So executives, again, we come back to the topic of culture, right? So everybody's now ultra sensitive to what is the culture that we need to put in place, what's the environment we need to create for people to be happy, what level of flexibility do we need, and obviously in the technology and digital domain, it's really gone quite to quite an extreme level. Now an interesting point that I want to throw out there right now then is that arguably leadership and people management now has become extremely difficult, because the whole notion of people management used to be also about seeing people regularly and physically, and obviously that's now not the case. So there is a challenge for management in general and for executives around how do we lead and manage people in this new modern workforce, flexible workforce environment. So I think, if you're a candidate today, and I'm thinking about the audience out there, I mean, it's worth spending a bit of time looking at, your people management skills and your leadership skills, and, trying to understand, how do I fit into this context, right? What's the kind of culture what are the cultures I've lived in? What are the cultures that I appreciate, the environments that I appreciate, where we can drive performance in a caring way? And, do you adhere to these values? Because I think right now, most boards are looking for that kind of leadership in the world we're in today.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? Because the other side of this is not so much the executive asking for work-life balance, but also how does the executive manage productivity across a team, maybe working remotely, or themselves, right? Their team is looking for work-life balance, and we definitely hear a lot about how do you measure productivity across a remote team. So that's really interesting to know that boards are looking for candidates who have experience and their capabilities across that as well. Great feedback on that. We're going to shift a little bit to talking about assessing desired work-life balance. And, one of the things that probably comes up is, what are some things that can be negotiated in terms of work-life balance benefits? And Greta, you mentioned a little bit of this in your previous response. I'm going to turn it over to you first. But what are some things that candidates can negotiate for in terms of benefits?
Absolutely. And I think one thing here is that, to be honest, most companies are in uncharted territory. Let's say it's still, I would say, a developing story. People, you hear of companies asking people to come back, but then they want to be a little bit flexible. And then it's really pushing people to try to move back to the office again. And then it's back again to being flexible because they want to attract the talent. I think nowadays, of course, people sort of it's a candidate-driven market. Yeah, there's how can I say, people looking for a position can actually afford to be a little bit picky, let's say, in what they choose. And this, I think, of course, when it comes to negotiation, of course, gives you a lot of scope, to ask for things. I mean, some things that come to mind, and I'm sure it's not an exhaustive list by any means because we're all individuals anyway. So obviously, different things would be important for different people. But of course, the flexible hours. So not everybody likes to start at 8 in the morning. So some people maybe want to have different working hours. Certainly for people who have long commute to work, perhaps working on the train could be considered, as being also working time, for instance. Of course, if it is really possible, to do this. Obviously, negotiating some home office days. I think this has become quite normal. Childcare potentially could also be something that will make obviously everybody's life a little bit easier. Generally, some companies like to offer gym memberships and other things like that to encourage actually employees to have sort of a life outside of work. But I think one of the most important things, and Chris kind of preempted this, is by saying really the management as such needs to look at ways to make sure that now everybody's is evaluated, not just on being present in the office, but that actually they are evaluated on productivity, on output base, on results. And of course, this means potentially changing certain KPIs or certain bonus structures, to be in line with something that can be actually achievable, and not just by physically being in the office, but actually by really showing your results that you can achieve also from home. And I think one thing that here in Switzerland has become also fairly, I would say, common is the ability to be able to actually buy extra holidays, for example. So here in Switzerland, we have, depending on the contract you have, it's usually typically 25 days of holiday here in an annual contract. But actually, some companies are offering employees the option to actually buy more holidays if they feel that they need it. So these are just a few things. I'm sure there are many other things that can be negotiated, but those would be probably a few points from my side.
Great. Those are all great benefits I think candidates can ask for during the negotiation process. Gabrielle, is there any benefits that you think can be negotiated as well?
Well, yes, and before entering a negotiation, I would suggest having a plan, and before having a plan, I would say understand the culture, do a little research about the company. On the website, there's a lot of companies that really address the company culture and the perks and the benefits, and even now some work-life balance topics there on their website. So they're very open about it. So I would do a little research so you know how to address that when you come in.